Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. We've got 2 new characters coming to Disney Mirrorverse next month. It's going to be Violet, Parr from The Incredibles and Dory from Finding Nemo. Both are going to be supports and both have really interesting kits. This is going to be a first impression video of Violet. So without further ado, let's dive into her kit. So you can see her stats here in front of us. She's going to have nearly 7k health, 4,300 offense, 5,400 defense, 5,200 focus. I can tell you that she's on the low side of health for support, but she doesn't heal, so it doesn't really matter so much with Violet. She instead gives armor, so you're going to want to be focusing on that defense, and that defense is the highest of any support. So it's not quite up there with the defense of, tank guardians, but it's still pretty good considering she is a support role. Now let's look at her traits real quick. So she doesn't have a tower, which is a bit of a red flag, unfortunately. However, she does have quite a few different traits: stealthy, gravity defying, lawful and Pixar, so I'm sure we will get some use out of her. Maybe she'll feature as a dungeon character, I don't know, but slightly unfortunate there not to have a tower. Let's move on to abilities. Okay, so a core ability. At the start of combat, all enemies are going to be inflicted with a minus 40% critical damage debuff for the remainder of the counter or until she's defeated. So this to me screams a counter really for ranged, because ranged effectively have high focus, which increases critical chance and critical damage. So if she's inflicting characters with a 40% critical damage debuff, it's going to affect range that kind of rely on those crit hits to do big damage. Then we've got heavy attacks inflict shock, dealing 3% damage per second for 10 seconds. This isn't that great. It only stacks 1 and 3% damage per second for 10 seconds is nothing really. Compare that to someone like Zerg, who has 40% damage per second for 5 seconds on his special. The shock really isn't going to do much here. It's going to sort of pinprick your enemies, to be honest. And then we got a basic attacks having a 10% chance to grant allies a 20% defense buff, and these last for 10 seconds and you can stack them for 3. Interesting. Might help someone out like Maui, who converts defense buffs into armor. And then if Violet's target is inflicted with shock, her basics have a 35% chance to grant a defense buff. So interesting interaction there. Something that might help to boost her armor and, make her more survivable. Moving on, we've got Violet's special ability, which has a cooldown of 15 seconds. So, it's on the high end of the cooldowns, which is a bit of a shame. But this is a really, really cool ability because we've got a new buff in the game, and it's going to be Force Field. So Force Field creates this protective barrier that takes damage before armor and health. So it's just an additional layer really of protection. And it destroys projectiles on impact, preventing the target from being hit and stopping ricochets. So again, screaming counter to range, and then damage resistance is ignored when force fields absorb damage. So it just seems like a really cool ability, and I for one can't wait to see the actual animation in game. I reckon it's going to look very slick. In terms of the strength of the force field, it's going to be equal to 50% of Violet's defense. So if we go back to overview, that's going to be half of that. 5,416, so 2,708, which is a reasonable amount of protection. And this force field is going to last for 10 seconds or until destroyed. So realistically speaking, there's only going to be 5 seconds between her cooldown and her force field being able to be regenerated, which is pretty great actually. And while force field is active, the protected ally gains 100% resistance to shock and burn damage. So I can see this being really good against elementals. The new story modes and later levels in towers all seem to have elementals that can, shock and do burn and stuff. So I can imagine Violet being very good against them here. And then finally, for the first 5 seconds while a force field is active, it's going to grant that 2% armor per second. So in addition to her giving that 2,700 protection from the force field, she's also going to grant 2% armor per second. It's just going to make up for the fact that she doesn't heal, but in essence here we've got 2 layers of protection, one from the force field and then secondly from the armor. Face value, this is looking quite good. Right, lastly, her signature ability. I really like this. So Violet grants a force field to allies at the start of combat, and armor granted from the force field is increased by an additional 2%. So she's going to start the battle with this force field, and as I said, there's going to be effectively a 5-second lag between her cooldown and her ability to create these force fields, which I think is really awesome. And then this is the bit I assume is going to scale with the signets. So the armor granted from a force field is increased by additional 2%, and then the strength of her force fields is increased by an additional 50% of her defense. Max strength of a signature ability. She's going to be given out a force field which has 5,416 protection. know it's going to be 100% defense. And also she's going to be giving out armor at 20%. It's going to be 4% for 5 seconds. This is a very, very good signature ability, and one I think is going to elevate her in terms of her utility. Right, moving on to the talents. So we've got the first two, which is going to be defense and attack. Now, you know, you might want to use the defense because she's going to give armor and she's going to give force field based on defense. This might be one of the times where I say it's not the worst idea to actually have this steady hands equipped. However, if we move on to advanced and elite talents, these are really interesting. So we've got Shrinking Violet here. Once per encounter here, while at or below 50% health, Violet is going to gain a 20% defense buff that lasts for the rest of the encounter, and she's also going to gain an invisible buff for 15 seconds, which greatly lowers enemy aggression towards her. So basically, invisible buff, it means enemies are, it's like the opposite to lure. It just means enemies are going to avoid her and prioritize attacking her allies. I can't wait to see the animation here for this. I'm so glad that they included this. Whether it's going to be a very, very useful ability or not, I don't know, but I'm going to equip it anyway, just because, you know, Violet isn't Violet without her invisibility. So definitely want to see what that looks like. So then we've got Deflection Field. This is just a boost to her core ability, where she already removes 40% critical damage. Now she's going to be removing 80% critical damage, which is pretty massive. I think this is going to be great. I think this is going to be really useful against ranged again. So this is one I probably will end up equipping. I'm definitely intrigued to use Violet in some ranged missions to see how she fares there, because I think that's where she's going to shine. And then moving on, we've got Electrostatic Pulse. So when a force field is destroyed or expires, enemies are inflicted with shock, dealing 5% damage per second for 10 seconds, and then shocks inflicted by other allies deal additional 10% damage. Again, it's just not that much shock damage, if I'm being honest. I'm not sure how I feel about this one. I might equip it just to see how it works, but for me, I think I'd focus on some of the other talents. And then lastly, we've got Incredible Defenses. Now you're definitely going to want to equip this one. So when a force field is applied to an ally, adjacent enemies are knocked back. So this is massive. Basically, it's going to give a special ability a knockback as well, which is always amazing. It means you can disrupt specials. Big fan of this. And then allies resist 30% basic and heavy attack damage from tank and melee enemies while force fields are active. So this is kind of similar to Simba, and also makes me think that you might want to pair Violet up with Simba, because he's going to then get a 60% resistance to basic and heavy attacks from tank and melee enemies whilst, you know, under this force field. So I do think Simba might be an interesting pairing with her here. Big fan of this. I think it's going to work really well with tank and melee allies. Yeah, Violet has a really interesting kit, guys. So yeah, guys, that's my initial impressions on Violet. I think she's going to be a very unique and very interesting character. I like the fact that she brings something different to the game. She's going to be pretty useful against ranged enemies. The fact that she has a force field and can go invisible is very fitting. We'll just have to test and see how she gets on, but very excited for her. It's a shame she's not in Towers, but I'm sure we can make use of her in the game, and maybe she'll be useful for when Rift Rage drop. So guys, if you enjoyed the video, please leave me a like, consider subscribing. I'll be doing a Dory first impressions video very soon. Stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching.